Remember the show Wife Swap? Well, that was basically Victorian England. Divorce wasn't exactly a walk in the park a few hundred years ago, especially in certain communities and religions that still view it as taboo today. If you lived in Britain back then with its uptight sense of propriety and traditional values, where women were treated as mere possessions, suggesting a divorce would have been like suggesting you go skydiving without a parachute. Unless, of course, you were the King of England and could treat your wife like a hot potato. Back in the day, women could be sold at marketplaces, just like a side of beef. It was a popular practice starting in the 17th century and lasting until the early 1900s. The last recorded instance of this happened in 1913, which is when they finally said, "No more beef market, please." However, despite the possibility of divorce, it was often not a realistic option for those of lower socioeconomic status. The cost of obtaining a divorce and a requirement for a private act of parliament made it inaccessible for the working class and poor until 1857. As a result, wife selling became a last resort for some individuals seeking to dissolve their marriage. Although it's important to note that wife selling was not a widespread practice and only a limited number of recorded instances took place between 1692 and 1750. Welcome to this video delivered to you by History Insight. If you enjoy, please consider dropping a like and subscribe. Wife selling, it seems, gradually spread across England like a wildfire in the centuries following its first recorded incident. By the 1800s, it had become quite the fashionable trend in certain parts of the country. 20th century historian E.P. Thompson used his research along with cases documented in Samuel Pate Menefee's Wives for Sale book to conclude that there were at least 400 cases of wife selling that took place, with the latest one happening towards the end of the 1800s. Who says history can't be humorous? After all, 400 cases of wife selling is definitely a lot of wives to go around. In 1797, the Times documented an instance of wife selling at Smithfield Market, providing evidence that some found the practice distasteful. According to the account, a butcher had put his wife on display with a halter around her neck and waist, tying her to a railing. She was eventually purchased by a hog driver for 3 guineas and a crown, to the husband's delight. The article expressed regret that there was no means to stop such reprehensible behavior among the lower classes. During the early 1800s, including the time leading up to and after Queen Victoria's coronation in 1837, records of wife selling indicate that the process was similar to selling cattle at market. Advertisements for the sale would be made in advance, and the wife would be physically displayed to potential buyers with a halter around her neck or arm, and in some cases, her children would even be included in the transaction. This practice may come across as highly outrageous to contemporary society, but it does suggest that the wife had no control over the matter, which was not always the case. In early modern England, the end of a marriage wasn't always one-sided, and either spouse could be looking to move on. However, due to the unequal power dynamic, it was typically the man who made the decision to sell his wife to a new partner. Yet, in some instances, the sale had already been agreed upon and was simply a symbolic act of separation before remarrying. In 1915, an interesting instance of wife selling took place in Maidstone, where John Osborne transferred his wife and child to William Sergeant for the princely sum of £1, which is equivalent to around £121 in today's currency. Despite the common belief that the wife was merely the highest bidder's prize, the sale could not be finalized without her consent. An 1854 report from Manchester even highlighted a scenario where the wife was sold for a hefty amount, but upon meeting the buyer, she wasn't fond of him and was put up for sale again. The price for a wife could range greatly, with some cases recorded of wives being sold for £100 and their children fetching £25 each. While money was sometimes exchanged in wife sales, it wasn't always the primary objective. Some sales were simply symbolic, with just a few shillings or some beer or sixpence being given to show that a transaction had taken place. This is why marketplace settings were popular for these sales. The large crowds served as witnesses to the husband and wife separation, and the halter, though demeaning, symbolized the completion of the transaction when it was passed from the previous husband to the new buyer along with the exchange of money or goods. An example of this is a sale from 1865. It seems that the practice of wife selling was most prevalent in the north of England from 1760 to 1880, with Yorkshire leading the way in terms of number of cases. Despite Smithfield Market in London's reputation as a hub for wife sales, it was in Yorkshire where the majority of such events took place. Even across the Channel in France, accounts of Smithfield's practices were widely known and seen as a symbol of England's lack of civilization. As noted by Scottish author Robert Chambers in his 1864 book, The Book of Days, a sale that took place in 1832 made a lasting impression on the French, who constantly referenced it as evidence of England's backwards ways. However, despite the decline in popularity of wife selling, it did not completely disappear. The sale of wives still took place, particularly among the working class and rural communities, where traditional gender roles and cultural practices were still deeply ingrained. Although the Matrimony Act aimed to make divorce more accessible, it still did not address the underlying power imbalance between men and women in marriage, which contributed to the persistence of wife selling. The requirement for a man to simply prove his wife's adultery for a divorce, while women were required to provide additional evidence of their husband's cruelty or wrongdoing, perpetuated the unequal treatment of women in the legal system. Contrary to popular belief, husband selling wasn't completely unheard of. Although records of this are limited and it was likely a rare occurrence, there were instances where it took place. However, it is important to note that during the Victorian era, women's rights were limited and their husbands were responsible for their financial stability. If a husband abandoned his wife, he was legally responsible and could be imprisoned for doing so, so selling her to another man was a way to secure her financial future. In contrast, if a woman sold her husband, she would immediately have to find someone else to support her as women had limited means of income. The societal consequences of being single and a burden on the parish would be something most women would not want to face after being supported by a husband. Although papers of the time criticized wife selling, it was never officially made illegal, and there are no records of any clergy condemning it outright. This suggests that it was seen as a necessary evil, outwardly criticized, but understood as a necessary practice in certain circumstances. Another account of wife selling was documented by the Times in 1797 at Smithfield Market, where a butcher put his wife up for sale with a halter around her neck and waist, tied to a railing. The wife was eventually purchased by a hog driver for the sum of 3 guineas and a crown. These records provide insight into the practice of wife selling during the time period. In conclusion, wife selling was a disturbing yet fascinating aspect of Victorian England that sheds light on the unequal status of women in that time period. It's important to remember the historical context of this practice and understand that it was a result of the limited options available to women, who were often at the mercy of their husbands. Thank you for watching this episode of History Insight, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more engaging content that brings history to life.